Well, hello, Forest Meadow, and welcome back to our sermon reflections. And as most of you know, I wasn't there on Sunday because I was sick, along with much of my family. And in light of that, I just want to say a huge thanks to Robert, who led Sunday school, and also a huge thanks to Isaac for delivering the message kind of last minute. We knew it might happen, but didn't expect it to really happen. But speaking of that message, there's several things that I'm reflecting upon. And one of the primary things is something that Isaac said. He says, don't put fences around the commandments of God, or we shouldn't at least. And this strict way of thinking that the Pharisees had, whenever we apply it to our lives, it makes keeping the commandments of God so burdensome, or at least it makes our perception of keeping God's commands so burdensome. And so let's stop and remember that the Pharisees, this group of people that Jesus is criticizing, they started off by trying to keep themselves and the people of God away from idolatry. It's a very good thing. It goes back to the almost to the time of exile in Babylon. These people were so determined to obey what God had said because of their past mistakes that they swung to this other extreme of strictness. And their motives, it seemed like at the time, were good, but their overly strict tradition suffocated the people who just wanted to be obedient to God. And so the sacrifices ended up costing more, the expectations were much higher, and it was eventually beyond their capability to keep, and even the Pharisees couldn't keep them. But they did still expect other people to keep them. And though it seems that the Pharisees were very determined to obey God's commands, they were really more determined to obey the tradition as long as it was in a public place. And so, brothers and sisters, we have to guard ourselves from doing things like they did, right? They were doing good things, but just to be noticed by other people as being righteous. It's a form of deception, and it has the goal of self-righteousness and prestige and hubris, right? It's just pride. And so this desire, I think, corrupted all their other desires for that which was good. They no longer desired what was simply good. They desired to be perceived as doing things that are good. They didn't care much for offering something to God, but rather they wanted to be seen as offering even the smallest things to God, like mint and dill. But they refused to offer the one thing that really counted. They refused to give God themselves. They weren't devoted to God, they were devoted to themselves. And so they were the true altar of their own worship. Something else that struck me is very personal, right? But we ought to spend time reflecting upon our spiritual drift. And here's a few questions. How is communion lately? Was there ever a time when it seemed more sacred than it is now? What about our worship and the time that we spend singing songs to God? Do they seem trivial? Do your prayers before meals, do they seem like you're just repeating the same old things? These are just a few small indicators that may tip us off that perhaps we have drifted in our devotion to the Lord. Perhaps we're doing the things that look like worship on the outside, but our hearts are not truly pointed towards God. We have to remember Jesus' teaching in Matthew chapter 15. Here Jesus, he quotes actually from Isaiah the prophet in Isaiah 29 verse 13. He says, "This people draw near with their words and honor me with their lip service, but they remove their hearts far from me, and their reverence for me consists of tradition learned by rote." Now, I'm tempted here to say that these Pharisees, they lost their reverence for God, but they didn't lose it because it makes it sound like it was an accident. And although this type of drift may not be it may not be intentional, it's not by accident that we drift. We drift, brothers and sisters, by everyday small decisions that we make, to ignore God, to compromise a bit, to enjoy it too much when someone notices our good deeds, to despise someone whenever they didn't notice the good thing that we did. Perhaps it's overt sin that we compromise in. Perhaps it looks like righteousness, but it's really just self-righteousness. Perhaps it looks like submission, but it's deceptive rebellion. I don't know what it is, but we can really easily deceive ourselves into thinking that what we're doing is just okay, and we slowly and quietly drift from God. We can't believe every thought that we have because they're not all true. But let's run back to the Lord, the one who not only holds the truth, but who himself is the truth. And let's not reflect upon how other people perceive us, the people who are around us, perhaps. Let's not reflect upon them either, but let's consider how we ourselves may have drifted from the Lord and simply come back to God with our broken desires, our double-mindedness, and let's ask God to correct our hearts and minds and to give us a genuine, sincere love for Him and for His glory. Let's go ahead and move on to our questions for the week. Our first question is this: why is Jesus so direct and scornful to the Pharisees? Number 2, why does he call them blind guides, and how is this appropriate? Number 3, if the law is good, how can following it be bad? Number 4, how did the Pharisees follow the law, and what exactly were they missing? Number 5, what was Jesus demonstrating when using examples of gnats, camels, and spices? And how might we be guilty of straining out gnats and swallowing camels? Number 6, how does Jesus compare the Pharisees to their ancestors, and how are they different and alike? Number 7, what does Jesus mean in Matthew 23:32 when he says, "Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers"? Number 8, why does Jesus emphasize the Pharisees taking oaths and swearing? And why did they do this, and why is it bad? And for that, I want you to consider James 5:12, Judges 11, verses 29 through 40, and 1 Samuel 14. Number 9, how does legalism infect our thinking and our outlook? And I want you to consider Luke 18, verses 9 through 14, Galatians 2, verses 15 through 21, Colossians 2, verses 16 through 23, and Romans 14. Boy, that's a lot. Number 10, what changes do we need to make to avoid becoming blind guides? And how do we see what God intends for us? And I want you to look at Micah chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. Well, thank you guys so much for taking the time to join us for this week. Just as a quick heads up, this next week we're going to be finishing up Matthew chapter 23, but then there's one other thing, one invitation I want to give to you. Perhaps some of you are out there and maybe you have some questions about textual criticism or verse 14, which of course Isaac mentioned during his message. Or perhaps you have questions about some of these variants that he mentioned. And if you do, I want to invite you to come and to ask those questions, because those questions are very good. They're worth asking, and there's also some very good answers to those questions. So I just want to take the time to personally invite you. Let us know if you have questions about this. We do hope one of these days, sometime relatively soon, to actually talk about this in greater detail. But in the meantime, let me know your thoughts or your questions. And so thank you guys so much for taking the time to join us today. And other than that, I hope you have a great day.